Frank Sinatra, holding a glass of bourbon in one hand and a cigarette in the other, stood in a dark corner of the bar between two attractive but fading blondes who sat waiting for him to say something. But he said nothing. He had been silent during much of the evening, except now in this private club in Beverly Hills he seemed even more distant, staring out through the smoke and semi-darkness into a large room beyond the bar where dozens of young couples sat huddled around small tables or twisted in the center of the floor to the clamorous clang of folk rock music blaring from the stereo. The two blondes knew, as did Sinatra's four male friends who stood nearby, that it was a bad idea to force conversation upon him when he was in this mood of sullen silence. A mood that had hardly been uncommon during this first week of November, a month before his 50th birthday. Sinatra had been working in a film that he now disliked, could not wait to finish. He was now tired of all the publicity attached to his dating the 20-year-old Mia Farrow, who was not in sight today. He was angry that a CBS television documentary of his life, to be shown in 2 weeks, was reportedly prying into his privacy, even speculating on his possible friendship with mafia leaders. He was worried about his starring role in an hour-long NBC show entitled Sinatra, A Man and His Music, which would require that he sing 18 songs with a voice that at this particular moment, just a few nights before the taping was to begin, was weak and sore and uncertain. Sinatra was ill. He was the victim of an ailment so common that most people would consider it trivial. But when it gets to Sinatra, it can plunge him into a state of anguish, deep depression, panic, even rage. Frank Sinatra had a cold. Sinatra with a cold is Picasso without paint, Ferrari without fuel, only worse. For the common cold robs Sinatra of that uninsurable jewel, his voice, cutting into the core of his confidence, and it affects not only his own psyche but also seems to cause a kind of psychosomatic nasal drip within dozens of people who work for him, drink with him, love him, depend on him for their own welfare and stability. A Sinatra with a cold can, in a small way, send vibrations through the entertainment industry and beyond, as surely as a president of the United States, suddenly sick, can shake the national economy. For Frank Sinatra was now involved with many things involving many people, his own film company, his recording company, his private airline, his missile parts firm, his real estate holdings across the nation, his personal staff of 75, which are only a portion of the power he is and has come to represent. He seemed now to be also the embodiment of the fully emancipated male, perhaps the only one in America, the man who can do anything he wants, anything, can do it because he has the money, the energy, and no apparent guilt. In an age when the very young seem to be taking over, protesting and picketing and demanding change, Frank Sinatra survives as a national phenomenon, one of the few pre-war products to withstand the test of time. He is the champ who made the big comeback, the man who had everything, lost it, then got it back, letting nothing stand in his way, doing what few men can do. He uprooted his life, left his family, broke with everything that was familiar, learning in the process that one way to hold a woman is not to hold her. Now he has the affection of Nancy and Ava and Maria, the fine female produce of 3 generations, and still has the adoration of his children, the freedom of a bachelor. He does not feel old. He makes old men feel young, makes them think that if Frank Sinatra can do it, it can be done. Not that they could do it, but it is still nice for other men to know, at 50, that it can be done. But now, standing at this bar in Beverly Hills, Sinatra had a cold, and he continued to drink quietly, and he seemed miles away in his private world, not even reacting when suddenly the stereo in the other room switched to a Sinatra song, in the wee small hours of the morning. It is a lovely ballad that he first recorded 10 years ago, and it now inspired many young couples who had been sitting, tired of twisting, to get up and move slowly around the dance floor, holding one another very close. Sinatra's intonation, precisely clipped, yet full and flowing, gave a deeper meaning to the simple lyrics. In the wee small hours of the morning, while the whole wide world is fast asleep, you lie awake and think about the girl. It was, like so many of his classics, a song that evoked loneliness and sensuality, and when blended with the dim light and the alcohol and nicotine and late-night needs, it became a kind of airy aphrodisiac. Undoubtedly the words from this song, and others like it, had put millions in the mood. It was music to make love by, and doubtless much love had been made by it all over America at night, in cars, while the batteries burned down, in cottages by the lake, on beaches during balmy summer evenings, in secluded parks and exclusive penthouses and furnished rooms, in cabin cruisers and cabs and cabanas. In all places where Sinatra's songs could be heard were these words that warmed woman, wooed and won them, snipped the final thread of inhibition, and gratified the male egos of ungrateful lovers. 2 generations of men had been the beneficiaries of such ballads, for which they were eternally in his debt, for which they may eternally hate him. Nevertheless, here he was, the man himself, in the early hours of the morning in Beverly Hills, out of range. The 2 blondes, who seemed to be in their middle 30s, were preened and polished, their matured bodies softly molded within tight dark suits. They sat, legs crossed, perched on the high bar stools. They listened to the music. Then one of them pulled out a Kent, and Sinatra quickly placed his gold lighter under it, and she held his hand, looked at his fingers. They were nubby and raw, and the pinkies protruded, being so stiff from arthritis that he could barely bend them. He was, as usual, immaculately dressed. He wore an Oxford gray suit with a vest, a suit conservatively cut on the outside, but trimmed with flamboyant silk within. His shoes, British, seemed to be shined even on the bottom of the soles. He also wore, as everybody seemed to know, a remarkably convincing black hairpiece, one of the 60 that he owns. Most of them under the care of an inconspicuous little gray-haired lady who, holding his hair in a tiny satchel, follows him around whenever he performs. She earns $400 a week. The most distinguishing thing about Sinatra's face are his eyes, clear blue and alert, eyes that within seconds can go cold with anger, or glow with affection, or, as now, reflect a vague detachment that keeps his friends silent and distant. Lee DeRoche, one of Sinatra's closest friends, was now shooting pool in the small room behind the bar. Standing near the door was Jim Mahoney, Sinatra's press agent, a somewhat chunky young man with a square jaw and narrow eyes who would resemble a tough Irish plainclothesman if it were not for the expensive continental suits he wears and his exquisite shoes often adorned with polished buckles. Also nearby was a big, broad-shouldered 200-pound actor named Brad Dexter, who seemed always to be thrusting out his chest so that his gut would not show. Brad Dexter had appeared in several films and television shows, displaying fine talents as a character actor, but in Beverly Hills he is equally known for the role he played in Hawaii 2 years ago when he swam a few hundred yards and risked his life to save Sinatra from drowning in a riptide. Since then, Dexter has been one of Sinatra's constant companions and has been made a producer in Sinatra's film company. He occupies a plush office near Sinatra's executive suite. He is endlessly searching for literary properties that might be converted into new starring roles for Sinatra. Whenever he is among strangers with Sinatra, he worries because he knows that Sinatra brings out the best and worst in people. Some men will become aggressive, some women will become seductive, others will stand around skeptically appraising him. The scene will be somehow intoxicated by his mere presence, and maybe Sinatra himself, if feeling as badly as he was tonight, might become intolerant or tense, and then headlines. So Brad Dexter tries to anticipate danger and warns Sinatra in advance. He confesses to feeling very protective of Sinatra, admitting in a recent moment of self-revelation, "I'd kill for him." While this statement may seem outlandishly dramatic, particularly when taken out of context, it nonetheless expresses a fierce fidelity that is quite common within Sinatra's special circle. It is a characteristic that Sinatra, without admission, seems to prefer. All the way, all or nothing at all. This is the Sicilian in Sinatra. He permits his friends, if they wish to remain that, none of the easy Anglo-Saxon outs. But if they remain loyal, then there is nothing Sinatra will not do in turn. Fabulous gifts, personal kindnesses, encouragement when they're down, adulation when they're up. They are wise to remember, however, one thing. He is Sinatra, the boss, il padrone. I had seen something of this Sicilian side of Sinatra last summer at Jilly's Saloon in New York, which was the only other time I'd gotten a close view of him prior to this night in this California club. Jilly's, which is on West 52nd Street in Manhattan, is where Sinatra drinks whenever he is in New York, and there's a special chair reserved for him in the back room against the wall that nobody else may use. When he is occupying it, seated behind a long table flanked by his closest New York friends, who include the saloon keeper, Jilly Rizzo, and Jilly's azure-haired wife, Honey, who is known as the Blue Jew, a rather strange, ritualistic scene develops. That night, dozens of people, some of them casual friends of Sinatra's, some mere acquaintances, some neither, appeared outside of Jilly's saloon. They approached it like a shrine. They had come to pay respect. They were from New York, Brooklyn, Atlantic City, Hoboken. They were old actors, young actors, former prize fighters, tired trumpet players, politicians, a boy with a cane. There was a fat lady who said she remembered Sinatra when he used to throw the Jersey Observer onto her front porch in 1933. There were middle-aged couples who said they had heard Sinatra sing at the Rustic Cabin in 1938, and we knew then that he really had it. Or they had heard him when he was with Harry James' band in 1939, or with Tommy Dorsey in 1941. Yeah, that's the song. I'll Never Smile Again. He sang it one night in this dump near Newark, and we danced. Or they remembered that time at the Paramount with the Swooners, and him with those bow ties, the voice, and one woman remembered that awful boy she knew then, Alexander Dorogokupets, an 18-year-old heckler who had thrown a tomato at Sinatra, and the Bobby Soxers in the balcony had tried to flail him to death. Whatever became of Alexander Dorogokupets, the lady did not know. And they remembered when Sinatra was a failure and sang trash like Maresy Dotes, and they remembered his comeback, and on this night they were all standing outside Jilly's saloon, dozens of them, but they could not get in. So some of them left, but most of them stayed, hoping that soon they might be able to push or wedge their way into Jilly's between the elbows and backsides of the men drinking 3 deep at the bar, and they might be able to peek through and see him sitting back there. This is all they really wanted. They wanted to see him, and for a few moments they gazed in silence through the smoke and they stared. Then they turned, fought their way out of the bar, went home. Some of Sinatra's close friends, all of whom are known to the men guarding Jilly's door, do manage to get an escort into the back room. But once they are there, they, too, must fend for themselves. On the particular evening, Frank Gifford, the former football player, got only 7 yards in 3 tries. Others, who had somehow been close enough to shake Sinatra's hand, did not shake it. Instead, they just touched him on the shoulder or sleeve, or they merely stood close enough for him to see them and, after he'd given them a wink of recognition or a wave or a nod, or called out their names, he has a fantastic memory for first names, they would then turn and leave. They had checked in, they had paid their respects, and as I watched this ritualistic scene, I got the impression that Frank Sinatra was dwelling simultaneously in 2 worlds that were not contemporary. On the one hand, he is the swinger, as he is when walking and joking with Sammy Davis Jr., Richard Conte, Liza Minnelli, Bernice Massey, or any of the other show business people who get to sit at the table. On the other, as when he is nodding or waving to his paisanos who are close to him, Al Silvani, a boxing manager who works with Sinatra's film company, Dominic DeBona, his wardrobe man, Ed Pucci, a 300-pound former football lineman who is his aide-de-camp. Frank Sinatra is Il Padrone. Or better still, he is what in traditional Sicily have been long called uomini rispettati, men of respect, men who are both majestic and humble, men who are loved by all and are very generous by nature, men whose hands are kissed as they walk from village to village, men who would personally go out of their way to redress a wrong. Frank Sinatra does things personally. At Christmas time, he will personally pick dozens of presents for his close friends and family, remembering the type of jewelry they like, their favorite colors, the sizes of their shirt and dresses. When a musician friend's house was destroyed and his wife was killed in a Los Angeles mudslide a little more than a year ago, Sinatra personally came to his aid, finding the musician a new home, paying whatever hospital bills were left unpaid by the insurance, then personally supervising the furnishing of the new home down to the replacing of the silverware, the linen, the purchase of new clothing. The same Sinatra who did this can, with the same hour, explode in a towering rage of intolerance should a small thing be incorrectly done for him by one of his paisanos. For example, when one of his men brought him a frankfurter with catsup on it, which Sinatra apparently abhors, he angrily threw the bottle at the man, splattering catsup all over him. Most of the men who work around Sinatra are big, but this never seems to intimidate Sinatra nor curb his impetuous behavior with them when he is mad. They will never take a swing back at him. He is Il Padrone. At other times, aiming to please, his men will overreact to his desires. When he casually observed that his big orange desert Jeep in Palm Springs seemed in need of new painting, the word was swiftly passed down through channels, becoming even more urgent as it went, until finally it was a command that the Jeep be painted now, immediately, yesterday. To accomplish this would require the hiring of a special crew of painters to work all night, at overtime rates, which, in turn, meant that the order had to be bucked back up the line for further approval. When it finally got back to Sinatra's desk, he did not know what it was all about. After he had figured it out, he confessed, with a tired look on his face, that he did not care when the hell they painted his Jeep. Yet, it would have been unwise for anyone to anticipate his reaction, for he is a wholly unpredictable man of many moods and great dimension, a man who responds instantaneously to instinct, suddenly, dramatically, wildly he responds, and nobody can predict what will follow. A young lady named Jane Hogue, a reporter at Life's Los Angeles bureau, who had attended the same school as Sinatra's daughter, Nancy, had once been invited to a party at Miss Sinatra's California home, at which Frank Sinatra, who maintains very cordial relations with his former wife, acted as a host. Early in the party, Miss Hogue, while leaning against a table, accidentally with her elbow knocked over one of a pair of alabaster birds to the floor, smashing it to pieces. Suddenly, Miss Hogue recalled. Sinatra's daughter cried, "Oh, that was one of Mother's favorite." But before she could complete the sentence, Sinatra glared at her, cutting her off, and while 40 other guests in the room all stared in silence, Sinatra walked over, quickly with his finger flicked the other alabaster bird off the table, smashing it to pieces, and then put an arm gently around Jane Hogue and said, in a way that put her completely at ease, "That's okay, kid." Now Sinatra said a few words to the blondes. Then he turned from the bar and began to walk toward the pool room. One of Sinatra's other men friends moved in to keep the girls company. Brad Dexter, who had been standing in the corner talking to some other people, now followed Sinatra. The room cracked with the clack of billiard balls. There were about a dozen spectators in the room, most of them young men who were watching Leo DeRoche shoot against two other aspiring hustlers who were not very good. This private drinking club has among its membership many actors, directors, writers, models, nearly all of them a good deal younger than Sinatra or DeRoche, and much more casual in the way they dress for the evening. Many of the young women, their long hair flowing loosely below their shoulders, wore tight, fanny-fitting Jack's pants and very expensive sweaters, and a few of the young men wore blue or green velour shirts with high collars and narrow tight pants, and Italian loafers. It was obvious from the way Sinatra looked at these people in the pool room that they were not his style, but he leaned back against a high stool that was against the wall, holding his drink in his right hand, and said nothing, just watched DeRoche slam the billiard balls back and forth. The younger men in the room, accustomed to seeing Sinatra at this club, treated him without deference, although they said nothing offensive. They were a cool young group, very California, cool and casual, and one of the coolest seemed to be a little guy, very quick of movement, who had a sharp profile, pale blue eyes, blondish hair, and squared eyeglasses. He wore a pair of brown corduroy slacks, a green shaggy dog Shetland sweater, a tan suede jacket, and game warden boots, for which he had recently paid $60. Frank Sinatra, leaning against the stool, sniffling a bit from his cold, could not take his eyes off the game warden boots. Once, after gazing at them for a few moments, he turned away, but now he was focused on them again. The owner of the boots, who was just standing in them watching the pool game, was named Harlan Ellison, a writer who had just completed work on a screenplay, The Oscar. Finally, Sinatra could not contain himself. "Hey," he yelled in his slightly harsh voice that still had a soft, sharp edge. "Those Italian boots?" "No," Ellison said. "Spanish?" "No." "Are they English boots?" "Look, I don't know, man," Ellison shot back, frowning at Sinatra, then turning away again. Now the pool room was suddenly silent. Leo DeRoche, who had been poised behind his cue stick and was bent low, just froze in that position for a second. Nobody moved. Then Sinatra moved away from the stool and walked with that slow, arrogant swagger of his toward Ellison, the hard tap of Sinatra's shoes the only sound in the room. Then looking down at Ellison with a slightly raised eyebrow and a tricky little smile, Sinatra asked, "You expecting a storm?" Harlan Ellison moved a step to the side. "Look, is there any reason why you're talking to me?" "I don't like the way you're dressed," Sinatra said. "Hate to shake you up," Ellison said, "but I dress to suit myself." Now there was some rumbling in the room, and somebody said, "Come on, Harlan, let's get out of here," and Leo DeRoche made his pool shot and said, "Yeah, come on." But Ellison stood his ground. Sinatra said, "What do you do?" "I'm a plumber," Ellison said. No, he's not," another young man quickly yelled from across the table. "He wrote the Oscar." "Oh, yeah," Sinatra said. "Well, I've seen it, and it's a piece of crap." "That's strange," Ellison said, "because they haven't even released it yet." "Well, I've seen it," Sinatra repeated, "and it's a piece of crap." Now Brad Dexter, very anxious, very big opposite the small figure of Ellison, said, "Come on, kid, I don't want you in this room." "Hey," Sinatra interrupted Dexter, "can't you see I'm talking to this guy?" Dexter was confused. Then his whole attitude changed, and his voice went soft and he said to Ellison, almost with a plea, "Why do you persist in tormenting me?" The whole scene was becoming ridiculous. and it seemed that Sinatra was only half serious, perhaps just reacting out of sheer boredom or inner despair. At any rate, after a few more exchanges, Harlan Ellison left the room. By this time, the word had gotten out to those on the dance floor about the Sinatra-Ellison exchange, and somebody went to look for the manager of the club. But somebody else said that the manager had already heard about it, and had quickly gone out the door, hopped in his car, and drove home. So the assistant manager went into the pool room. "I don't want anybody in here without coats and ties," Sinatra snapped. The assistant manager nodded, and walked back to his office. It was the morning after. It was the beginning of another nervous day for Sinatra's press agent, Jim Mahoney. Mahoney had a headache, and he was worried, but not over the Sinatra-Ellison incident of the night before. At the time, Mahoney had been with his wife at a table in the other room, and possibly he had not even been aware of the little drama. The whole thing had lasted only about 3 minutes, and 3 minutes after it was over, Frank Sinatra had probably forgotten about it for the rest of his life, as Ellison will probably remember it for the rest of his life. He had had, as hundreds of others before him, at an unexpected moment between darkness and dawn, a scene with Sinatra. It was just as well that Mahoney had not been in the pool room. He had enough on his mind today. He was worried about Sinatra's cold and worried about the controversial CBS documentary that, despite Sinatra's protests and withdrawal of permission, would be shown on television in less than 2 weeks. The newspapers this morning were full of hints that Sinatra might sue the network, and Mahoney's phones were ringing without pause. And now he was plugged into New York, talking to the Daily News' Kay Gardella, saying, "That's right, Kay. They made a gentleman's agreement to not ask certain questions about Frank's private life." And then Cronkite went right ahead. "Frank, tell me about those associations. That question, Kay, out. That question should never have been asked." As he spoke, Mahoney leaned back in his leather chair, his head shaking slowly. He is a powerfully built man of 37. He has a round, ruddy face, a heavy jaw, and narrow pale eyes, and he might appear pugnacious if he did not speak with such clear, soft sincerity, and if he were not so meticulous about his clothes. His suits and shoes are superbly tailored, which was one of the first things Sinatra noticed about him, and in his spacious office opposite the bar is a red muff electrical shoe polisher and a pair of brown wooden shoulders on a stand over which Mahoney can drape his jackets. Near the bar is an autographed photograph of President Kennedy and a few pictures of Frank Sinatra, but there are none of Sinatra in any other rooms in Mahoney's public relations agency. There once was a large photograph of him hanging in the reception room, but this apparently bruised the egos of some of Mahoney's other movie star clients, and, since Sinatra never shows up at the agency anyway, the photograph was removed. Still, Sinatra seems ever present, and if Mahoney did not have legitimate worries about Sinatra, as he did today, he could invent them. And, as worry aids, he surrounds himself with little mementos of moments in the past when he did worry. In his shaving kit, there is a 2-year-old box of sleeping tablets dispensed by a Reno druggist. The date on the bottle marks the kidnapping of Frank Sinatra, Jr. There is on a table in Mahoney's office a mounted wood reproduction of Frank Sinatra's ransom note, written on the aforementioned occasion. One of Mahoney's mannerisms, when he is sitting at his desk worrying, is to tinker with the tiny toy train he keeps in front of him. The train is a souvenir from the Sinatra film, Von Ryan's Express. It is to men who are close to Sinatra what the PT-109 tie clasps are to men who are close to Kennedy, and Mahoney then proceeds to roll the little black train back and forth on the 6 inches of track. Back and forth, click-clack, click-clack. It is his Queeg thing. Now Mahoney quickly put aside the little train. His secretary told him there was a very important call on the line. Mahoney picked it up, and his voice was even softer and more sincere than before. "Yes, Frank," he said. Right, yes, Frank." When Mahoney put down the phone quietly, he announced that Frank Sinatra had left in his private jet to spend the weekend at his home in Palm Springs, which is a 16-minute flight from his home in Los Angeles. Mahoney was now worried again. The Learjet that Sinatra's pilot would be flying was identical, Mahoney said, to the one that had just crashed in another part of California. On the following Monday, a cloudy and unseasonably cool California day, more than 100 people gathered inside a white television studio, an enormous room dominated by a white stage, white walls, and with dozens of lights and lamps dangling. It rather resembled a gigantic operating room. In this room, within an hour or so, NBC was scheduled to begin taping a 1-hour show that would be televised in color on the night of November 24th and would highlight, as much as it could in the limited time, the 25-year career of Frank Sinatra as a public entertainer. It would not attempt to probe, as the forthcoming CBS Sinatra documentary allegedly would, that area of Sinatra's life that he regards as private. The NBC show would be mainly an hour of Sinatra singing some of his hits that carried him from Hoboken to Hollywood, a show that would be interrupted only now and then by a few film clips and commercials for Budweiser beer. Prior to his cold, Sinatra had been very excited about this show. He saw here an opportunity to appeal not only to those nostalgic, but also to communicate his talent to some rock and rollers. In a sense, he was battling the Beatles. The press releases being prepared by Mahoney's agency stressed this, reading, "If you happen to be tired of kid singers wearing mops of hair thick enough to hide a crate of melons, it should be refreshing to consider the entertainment value of a video special titled Sinatra, A Man and His Music." But now in this NBC studio in Los Angeles, there was an atmosphere of anticipation and tension because of the uncertainty of the Sinatra voice. The 43 musicians in Nelson Riddle's orchestra had already arrived, and some were up on the white platform warming up. Dwight Hemian, a youthful sandy-haired director who had won praise for his television special on Barbra Streisand, was seated in the glass-enclosed control booth that overlooked the orchestra and stage. The camera crews, technical teams, security guards, Budweiser ad men were also standing between the floor lamps and cameras, waiting, as were a dozen or so ladies who worked as secretaries in other parts of the building, but had sneaked away so they could watch this. A few minutes before 11 o'clock, word spread quickly through the long corridor into the big studio that Sinatra was spotted walking through the parking lot and was on his way, and was looking fine. There seemed great relief among the group that was gathered, but when the lean, sharply dressed figure of the man got closer and closer, they saw to their dismay that it was not Frank Sinatra. It was his double, Johnny Delgado. Delgado walks like Sinatra, has Sinatra's build, and from certain facial angles does resemble Sinatra. But he seems a rather shy individual. 15 years ago, early in his acting career, Delgado applied for a role in From Here to Eternity. He was hired, finding out later that he was to be Sinatra's double. In Sinatra's latest film, Assault on a Queen, a story in which Sinatra and some fellow conspirators attempt to hijack the Queen Mary, Johnny Delgado doubles for Sinatra in some water scenes, and now, in this NBC studio, his job was to stand under the hot television lights, marking Sinatra's spots on the stage for the camera crews. 5 minutes later, the real Frank Sinatra walked in. His face was pale, his blue eyes seemed a bit watery. He had been unable to rid himself of the cold, but he was going to try to sing anyway, because the schedule was tight and thousands of dollars were involved at this moment in the assembling of the orchestra and crews and the rental of the studio. But when Sinatra, on his way to his small rehearsal room to warm up his voice, looked into the studio and saw that the stage and orchestra's platform were not close together, as he had specifically requested, his lips tightened and he was obviously very upset. A few moments later, from his rehearsal room, could be heard the pounding of his fist against the top of the piano and the voice of his accompanist, Bill Miller, saying softly, "Try not to upset yourself, Frank." Later, Jim Mahoney and another man walked in, and there was talk of Dorothy Kilgallen's death in New York earlier that morning. She had been an ardent foe of Sinatra for years, and he became equally uncomplimentary about her in his nightclub act, and now, though she was dead, he did not compromise his feelings. "Dorothy Kilgallen's dead," he repeated, walking out of the room toward the studio. "Well, guess I gotta change my whole act." When he strolled into the studio, the musicians all picked up their instruments and stiffened in their seats. Sinatra cleared his throat a few times and then, after rehearsing a few ballads with the orchestra, he sang "Don't Worry About Me" to his satisfaction and, being uncertain of how long his voice could last, suddenly became impatient. "Why don't we tape this, Mother?" he called out, looking up toward the glass booth where the director, Dwight Hemian, and his staff were sitting. Their heads seemed to be down, focusing on the control board. "Why don't we tape this, Mother?" Sinatra repeated. The production stage manager, who stands near the camera wearing a headset, repeated Sinatra's words exactly into his line to the control room. "Why don't we tape this, Mother?" Hemian did not answer. Possibly his switch was off. It was hard to know because of the obscuring reflections the lights made against the glass booth. "Why don't we put on a coat and tie," said Sinatra, then wearing a high-necked yellow pullover, "and tape this." Suddenly Hemian's voice came over the sound amplifier, very calmly. "Okay, Frank, would you mind going back over?" "Yes, I would mind going back," Sinatra snapped. The silence from Hemian's end, which lasted a second or two, was then again interrupted by Sinatra saying, "When we stop doing things around here the way we did them in 1960, maybe we—" And Sinatra continued to tear into Hemian, condemning as well the lack of modern techniques in putting such shows together. Then, possibly not wanting to use his voice unnecessarily, he stopped, and Dwight Hemian, very patient, so patient and calm that one would assume he had not heard anything that Sinatra had just said, outlined the opening part of the show, and Sinatra, a few minutes later, was reading his opening remarks, words that would follow, without a song, off the large idiot cards being held near the camera. Then, this done, he prepared to do the same thing on camera. Frank Sinatra Show, Act 1, page 10, take 1, called a man with a clapboard, jumping in front of the camera, clap, then jumping away again. Did you ever stop to think, Sinatra began, what the world would be like without a song? It would be a pretty dreary place. Gives you something to think about, doesn't it? Sinatra stopped. Excuse me, he said, adding, boy, I need a drink. They tried it again. Frank Sinatra Show, Act 1, page 10, take 2, yelled the jumping guy with the clapboard. Did you ever stop to think what the world would be like without a song? Frank Sinatra read it through this time without stopping. Then he rehearsed a few more songs, once or twice interrupting the orchestra when a certain instrumental sound was not quite what he wanted. It was hard to tell how well his voice was going to hold up, for this was early in the show. Up to this point, however, everybody in the room seemed pleased, particularly when he sung an old sentimental favorite written more than 20 years ago by Jimmy Van Heusen and Phil Silvers, Nancy, inspired by the first of Sinatra's 3 children when she was just a few years old. If you don't see her, each day I miss her. Gee, what a thrill each time I kiss her. As Sinatra sang these words, though he has sung them hundreds and hundreds of times in the past, it was suddenly obvious to everybody in the studio that something quite special must be going on inside the man, because something quite special was coming out. He was singing now, cold or no cold, with power and warmth. He was letting himself go. The public arrogance was gone. The private side was in this song about the girl who, it is said, understands him better than anybody else, and is the only person in front of whom he can be unashamedly himself. Nancy is 25. She lives alone, her marriage to singer Tommy Sands having ended in divorce. Her home is in a Los Angeles suburb, and she is now making her 3rd film and is recording for her father's record company. She sees him every day, or if not, he telephones, no matter if it be from Europe or Asia. When Sinatra's singing first became popular on radio, stimulating the swooners, Nancy would listen at home and cry. When Sinatra's first marriage broke up in 1951 and he left home, Nancy was the only child old enough to remember him as a father. She also saw him with Ava Gardner, Juliet Prowse, Mia Farrow, many others, has gone on double dates with him. She takes the winter and makes it summer. Summer could take some lessons from her. Nancy now also sees him visiting at home with his first wife, the former Nancy Barbado, a plasterer's daughter from Jersey City, whom he married in 1939 when he was earning $25 a week singing at the Rustic Cabin near Hoboken. The first Ms. Sinatra, a striking woman who has never remarried. When you've been married to Frank Sinatra, she once explained to a friend, lived in a magnificent home in Los Angeles with her younger daughter, Tina, who is 17. There is no bitterness, only great respect and affection between Sinatra and his first wife, and he has long been welcome in her home, and has even been known to wander in at odd hours, stoke the fire, lie on the sofa, and fall asleep. Frank Sinatra can fall asleep anywhere, something he learned when he used to ride bumpy roads with band buses. He also learned at that time, when sitting in a tuxedo, how to pinch the trouser creases in the back and tuck the jacket under and out, and fall asleep perfectly pressed. But he does not ride buses anymore, and his daughter Nancy, who in her younger days felt rejected when he slept on the sofa instead of giving attention to her, later realized that the sofa was one of the few places left in the world where Frank Sinatra could get any privacy, where his famous face would neither be stared at nor cause an abnormal reaction in others. She realized, too, that things normal have always eluded her father. His childhood was one of loneliness and a drive toward attention, and since attaining it, he has never again been certain of solitude. Upon looking out the window of a home he once owned in Hasbrook Heights, New Jersey, he would occasionally see the faces of teenagers peeking in, and in 1944, after moving to California and buying a home behind a 10-foot fence on Lake Toluca, he discovered that the only way to escape the telephone and other intrusions was to board the paddle boat with a few friends, a card table, and a case of beer, and stay afloat all afternoon. But he has tried, insofar as it has been possible, to be like everyone else, Nancy says. He wept on her wedding day. He is very sentimental and sensitive. "What the hell are you doing up there, Dwight?" Silence from the control booth. Got a party or something going on up there, Dwight? Sinatra stood on the stage, arms folded, glaring up across the cameras toward Hemian. Sinatra had sung Nancy with probably all he had in his voice on this day. The next few numbers contained raspy notes, and twice his voice completely cracked. But now Hemian was in the control booth, out of communication. Then he was down in the studio, walking over to where Sinatra stood. A few minutes later, they both left the studio and were on the way up to the control booth. The tape was replayed by Sinatra. He watched only about 5 minutes of it before he started to shake his head. Then he said to Hemian, "Forget it. Just forget it. You're wasting your time. What you got there?" Sinatra said, nodding to the singing image of himself on the television screen, "Is a man with a cold." Then he left the control booth, ordering that the whole day's performance be scrubbed and future taping postponed until he had recovered. Soon the word spread like an emotional epidemic down through Sinatra's staff, then fanned out through Hollywood, then was heard across the nation at Jilly's saloon, and also on the other side of the Hudson River in the homes of Frank Sinatra's parents and his other relatives and friends in New Jersey. When Frank Sinatra spoke with his father on the telephone and said he was feeling awful, the elder Sinatra reported that he was also feeling awful, that his left arm and fist were so stiff with a circulatory condition he could barely use them, adding that the ailment might be the result of having thrown too many left hooks during his days as a bantamweight almost 50 years ago. Martin Sinatra, a ruddy and tattooed little blue-eyed Sicilian born in Catania, boxed under the name of Marty O'Brien. In those days, in those places, with the Irish running the lower reaches of city life, it was not uncommon for Italians to wind up with such names. Most of the Italians and Sicilians who migrated to America just prior to the 1900s were poor and uneducated, were excluded from the building trades unions dominated by the Irish, and were somewhat intimidated by the Irish police, Irish priests, Irish politicians. One notable exception was Frank Sinatra's mother, Dolly, a large and very ambitious woman who was brought to this country at 2 months of age by her mother and father, a lithographer from Genoa. In labor years, Dolly Sinatra, possessing a round face and blue eyes, was often mistaken for being Irish, and surprised many at the speed with which she swung her heavy handbag at anyone uttering "wop." By playing skillful politics with North Jersey's democratic machine, Dolly Sinatra was to become, in her heyday, a kind of Catherine de Medici of Hoboken's Third Ward. She could always be counted upon to deliver 600 votes at election time from her Italian neighborhood, and this was her base of power. When she told one of the politicians that she wanted her husband to be appointed to the Hoboken Fire Department, and was told, "But, Dolly, we don't have an opening," she snapped, "Make an opening." They did. Years later, she requested that her husband be made a captain, and one day she got a call from one of the political bosses that began, "Dolly, congratulations." "For what?" "Captain Sinatra." "Oh, you finally made him one. Thank you very much." Then she called the Hoboken Fire Department. "Let me speak to Captain Sinatra," she said. The fireman called Martin Sinatra to the phone, saying, "Marty, I think your wife has gone nuts." When he got on the line, Dolly greeted him. "Congratulations, Captain Sinatra." Dolly's only child, christened Francis Albert Sinatra, was born and nearly died on December 12, 1916. It was a difficult birth, and during his first moment on earth he received marks he will carry till death. The scars on the left side of his neck being the result of a doctor's clumsy forceps, and Sinatra has chosen not to obscure them with surgery. After he was 6 months old, he was reared mainly by his grandmother. His mother had a full-time job as a chocolate dipper with a large firm, and was so proficient at it that the firm once offered to send her to the Paris office to train others. While some people in Hoboken remember Frank Sinatra as a lonely child, one who spent many hours on the porch gazing into space, Sinatra was never a slum kid, never in jail, always well-dressed. He had so many pants that some people in Hoboken called him Slacksy O'Brien. Dolly Sinatra was not the sort of Italian mother who could be appeased merely by a child's obedience and good appetite. She made many demands on her son, was always very strict. She dreamed of his becoming an aviation engineer. When she discovered Bing Crosby pictures hanging on his bedroom walls one evening, and learned that her son wished to become a singer too, she became infuriated and threw a shoe at him. Later, finding she could not talk him out of it, "He takes after me," she encouraged his singing. Many Italo-American boys of his generation were then shooting for the same star. They were strong with song, weak with words. Not a big novelist among them, no O'Hara, no Bellow, no Chavir, nor Shaw. Yet they could communicate bel canto. This was more in their tradition, no need for a diploma. They could, with a song, someday see their names in lights, Perry Como, Frankie Lane, Tony Bennett, Vic Damone, but none could see it better than Frank Sinatra. Though he sang through much of the night at the rustic cabin, he was up the next day singing without a fee on New York radio to get more attention. Later he got a job singing with Harry James' band, and it was there, in August of 1939, that Sinatra had his first recording hit, All or Nothing at All. He became very fond of Harry James and the men in the band, but when he received an offer from Tommy Dorsey, who in those days had probably the best band in the country, Sinatra took it. The job paid $126 a week, and Dorsey knew how to feature a vocalist. Yet Sinatra was very depressed at leaving James' band, and the final night with them was so memorable that, 20 years later, Sinatra could recall the details to a friend. The bus pulled out with the rest of the boys at about midnight. I'd said goodbye to them all, and it was snowing, I remember. There was nobody around, and I stood alone with my suitcase in the snow and watched the taillights disappear. Then the tears started, and I tried to run after the bus. There was such spirit and enthusiasm in that band. I hated leaving it. But he did, as he would leave other warm places, too, in search of something more, never wasting time, trying to do it all in one generation. Fighting under his own name, defending underdogs, terrorizing top dogs. He threw a punch at a musician who said something anti-Semitic, espoused the Negro, 'cause 2 decades before it became fashionable. He also threw a tray of glasses at Buddy Rich when he played the drums too loud. Sinatra gave away $50,000 worth of gold cigarette lighters before he was 30, was living an immigrant's wildest dream of America. He arrived suddenly on the scene when DiMaggio was silent, when paisanos were mournful, were quietly defensive about Hitler and their homeland. Sinatra became, in time, a kind of one-man anti-defamation league for Italians in America, the sort of organization that would be unlikely for them because, as the theory goes, they rarely agreed on anything, being extreme individualists, fine as soloists, but not so good in a choir, fine as heroes, but not so good in a parade. When many Italian names were used in describing gangsters on a television show, the Untouchables, Sinatra was loud in his disapproval. Sinatra and many thousands of other Italo-Americans were resentful as well when a small-time hoodlum, Joseph Valachi, was brought by Bobby Kennedy into prominence as a mafia expert, when indeed, from Valachi's testimony on television, he seemed to know less than most waiters on Mulberry Street. Many Italians in Sinatra's circle also regard Bobby Kennedy as something of an Irish cop, more dignified than those in Dolly's day, but no less intimidating. Together with Peter Lawford, Bobby Kennedy is said to have suddenly gotten cocky with Sinatra after John Kennedy's election, forgetting the contribution Sinatra had made in both fundraising and in influencing many anti-Irish Italian votes. Lawford and Bobby Kennedy are both suspected of having influenced the late president's decision to stay as a house guest with Bing Crosby instead of Sinatra, as originally planned, a social setback Sinatra may never forget. Peter Lawford has since been drummed out of Sinatra's summit in Las Vegas. "Yes, my son is like me," Dolly Sinatra says, proudly. "You cross him, he never forgets." And while she concedes his power, she quickly points out, he can't make his mother do anything she doesn't want to do, adding, "Even today, he wears the same brand of underwear I used to buy him." Today, Dolly Sinatra is 71 years old, a year or two younger than Martin, and all day long, people are knocking on the back door of her large home asking her advice, seeking her influence. When she is not seeing people and not cooking in the kitchen, she is looking after her husband, a silent but stubborn man, and telling him to keep his sore left arm resting on the sponge she has placed on the armrest of a soft chair. "Oh, he went to some terrific fires, this guy did," Dolly said to a visitor, nodding with admiration toward her husband in the chair. Though Dolly Sinatra has 87 godchildren in Hoboken, and still goes to that city during political campaigns, she now lives with her husband in a beautiful 16-room house in Fort Lee, New Jersey. This home was a gift from their son on their 50th wedding anniversary 3 years ago. The home is tastefully furnished and is filled with a remarkable juxtaposition of the pious and the worldly, photographs of Pope John and Ava Gardner, and Pope Paul and Dean Martin, several statues of saints and holy water, a chair autographed by Sammy Davis Jr., and bottles of bourbon. In Miss Sinatra's jewelry box is a magnificent strand of pearls she had just received from Ava Gardner, whom she liked tremendously as a daughter-in-law and still keeps in touch with and talks about, and hung on the wall is a letter addressed to Dolly and Martin. The sands of time have turned gold, yet love continues to unfold like the petals of a rose. In God's garden of life, may God love you through all eternity. I thank him. I thank you for being of one. Your loving son, Francis. Ms. Sinatra talks to her son on the telephone about once a week, and recently he suggested that, when visiting Manhattan, she make use of his apartment on East 72nd Street on the East River. This is an expensive neighborhood of New York, even though there's a small factory on the block, but this latter fact was seized upon by Dolly Sinatra as a means of getting back at her son for some unflattering descriptions of his childhood in Hoboken. What? You want me to stay in your apartment? In that dump? She asked. You think I'm going to spend the night in that awful neighborhood? Frank Sinatra got the point and said, Excuse me, Ms. Fort Lee. After spending the week in Palm Springs, his cold much better, Frank Sinatra returned to Los Angeles, a lovely city of sun and sex, a Spanish discovery of Mexican misery, a starland of little men and lithe women sliding in and out of convertibles in tense tight pants. Sinatra returned in time to see the long-awaited CBS documentary with his family. At about 9 p.m. he drove to the home of his former wife, Nancy, and had dinner with her and their 2 daughters. Their son, whom they rarely see these days, was out of town. Frank Jr., who was 22, was touring with a band and moving cross-country toward a New York engagement at Basin Street East with the Pied Pipers, with whom Frank Sinatra sang when he was with Dorsey's band in the 1940s. Today, Frank Sinatra Jr., whom his father says he named after Franklin D. Roosevelt, lives mostly in hotels, dines each evening in his nightclub dressing room, and sings until 2 a.m., accepting graciously, because he has no choice, the inevitable comparisons. His voice is smooth and pleasant, and improving with work, and while he is very respectful of his father, he discusses him with objectivity and in an occasional tone of subdued cockiness. Concurrent with his father's early fame, Frank Jr. said, was the creation of a press release Sinatra designed to set him apart from the common man, separate him from the realities. It was suddenly Sinatra, the electric magnate, Sinatra who is supernormal, not superhuman, but supernormal. And here, Frank Jr. continued, is the great fallacy, the great bullshit, for Frank Sinatra is normal, is the guy whom you'd meet on a street corner. But this other thing, the supernormal guys, has affected Frank Sinatra as much as anybody who watches one of his television shows or reads a magazine article about him. Frank Sinatra's life in the beginning was so normal, he said, that nobody would have guessed in 1934 that this little Italian kid with the curly hair would become the giant, the monster, the great living legend. He met my mother one summer on the beach. She was Nancy Barbato, daughter of Mike Barbato, a Jersey City plasterer. And she meets the fireman's son, Frank, one summer day on the beach at Long Branch, New Jersey. Both are Italian, both Roman Catholic, both lower middle class summer sweethearts. It is like a million bad movies starring Frankie Avalon. They have 3 children. The first child, Nancy, was the most normal of Frank Sinatra's children. Nancy was a cheerleader, went to summer camp, drove a Chevrolet, had the easiest kind of development centered around the home and family. Next is me. My life with the family is very, very normal up until September of 1958 when, in complete contrast to the rearing of both girls, I am put into a college preparatory school. I am now away from the inner family circle, and my position within has never been remade to this day. The 3rd child, Tina, and to be dead honest, I really couldn't say what her life is like. The CBS show, narrated by Walter Cronkite, began at 10 p.m. A minute before that, the Sinatra family, having cherished dinner, turned their chairs around and faced the camera, united for whatever disaster might follow. Sinatra's men in other parts of town, in other parts of the nation, were doing the same thing. Sinatra's lawyer, Milton A. Rudin, smoking a cigar, was watching with a keen eye, an alert legal mind. Other sets were watched by Brad Dexter, Jim Mahoney, Ed Pucci, Sinatra's makeup man, Shotgun Britton, his New York representative, Henry Gein, his haberdasher, Richard Carroll, his insurance broker, John Lilly, his valet, George Jacobs, a handsome Negro who, when entertaining girls in his apartment, plays records by Ray Charles. And like so much of Hollywood's fear, the apprehension about the CBS show all proved to be without foundation. It was a highly flattering hour that did not deeply probe, as rumors suggested it would, into Sinatra's love life, or the mafia, or other areas of his private province. While the documentary was not authorized, wrote Jack Gold in the next day's New York Times, it could have been. Immediately after the show, the telephones began to ring throughout the Sinatra system, conveying words of joy and relief, and from New York came Jilly's telegram, "We rule the world." The next day, standing in the corridor of the NBC building where he was about to resume taping his show, Sinatra was discussing the CBS show with several of his friends, and he said, "Oh, it was a gas." "Yeah, Frank, A hell of a show. But I think Jack Gold was right in the Times today, Sinatra said. There should have been more on the man, not so much on the music. They nodded, nobody mentioning the past hysteria in the Sinatra world when it seemed CBS was zeroing in on the man. They just nodded, and two of them laughed about Sinatra's apparently having gotten the word bird on the show, this being a favorite Sinatra word. He often inquires of his cronies, "How's your bird?" And when he nearly drowned in Hawaii, he later explained, "Just got a little water on my bird." And under a large photograph of him holding a whiskey bottle, a photo that hangs in the home of an actor friend named Dick Bacalian, the inscription reads, "Drink, Dickie, it's good for your bird." In the song Come Fly With Me, Sinatra sometimes alters the lyrics, "Just say the words and we'll take our birds down to Acapulco Bay." 10 minutes later, Sinatra, following the orchestra, walked into the NBC studio, which did not resemble in the slightest the scene here of 8 days ago. On this occasion, Sinatra was in fine voice. He cracked jokes between numbers. Nothing could upset him. Once, while he was singing, "How Can I Ignore the Girl Next Door?" standing on the stage next to a tree, a television camera mounted on a vehicle came rolling in too close and plowed against the tree. "Key riced!" yelled one of the technical assistants. But Sinatra seemed hardly to notice it. "We've had a slight accident," he said calmly. Then he began the song all over from the beginning. When the show was over, Sinatra watched the rerun on the monitor in the control room. He was very pleased, shaking hands with Dwight Hemian and his assistants. Then the whiskey bottles were opened in Sinatra's dressing room. Pat Lawford was there, and so were Andy Williams and a dozen others. The telegrams and telephone calls continued to be received from all over the country with praise for the CBS show. There was even a call, Mahoney said, from the CBS producer, Don Hewitt, with whom Sinatra had been so angry a few days before. And Sinatra was still angry, feeling that CBS had betrayed him, though the show itself was not objectionable. "Shall I drop a line to Hewitt?" Mahoney asked. "Can you send a fist through the mail?" Sinatra asked. "He has everything. He cannot sleep. He gives nice gifts. He is not happy, but he would not trade, even for happiness, what he is. He is a piece of our past, but only we have aged. He hasn't. We are dogged by domesticity. He isn't. We have compunctions. He doesn't. It is our fault, not his. He controls the menus of every Italian restaurant in Los Angeles. If you want North Italian cooking, fly to Milan. Men follow him, imitate him, fight to be near him. There is something of the locker room, the barracks about him. Bird, bird. He believes you must play it big, wide, expansively. The more open you are, the more you take in. Your dimensions deepen. You grow. You become more what you are, bigger, richer. He is better than anybody else, or at least they think he is, and he has to live up to it. Nancy Sinatra, Jr. He is calm on the outside. Inwardly, a million things are happening to him. Dick Bacalian. He has an insatiable desire to live every moment to its fullest because, I guess, he feels that right around the corner is extinction. Brad Dexter. All I ever got out of any of my miscarriages was the 2 years Artie Shaw financed on an analyst's couch, Ava Gardner. We weren't mother and son. We were buddies, Dolly Sinatra. I'm for anything that gets you through the night, be it prayer, tranquilizers, or a bottle of Jack Daniel, Frank Sinatra. Frank Sinatra was tired of all the talk, the gossip, the theory, tired of reading quotes about himself, of hearing what people were saying about him all over town. It had been a tedious 3 weeks, he said, and now he just wanted to get away, go to Las Vegas, let off some steam. So he hopped in his jet, soared over the California hills across the Nevada flats, then over miles and miles of desert to the sands and the Clay-Patterson fight. On the eve of the fight, he stayed up all night and slept through most of the afternoon, though his recorded voice could be heard singing in the lobby of the sands, in the gambling casino, even in the toilets, being interrupted every few bars, however, by the paging public address. Telephone call for Mr. Ron Fish, Mr. Ron Fish, with a ribbon of gold in her hair. Telephone call for Mr. Herbert Rothstein, Mr. Herbert Rothstein. Memories of a time so bright keep me sleepless through dark, endless nights. Standing around in the lobby of the Sands and other hotels up and down the Strip on this afternoon before the fight were the usual pre-fight prophets, the gamblers, the old champs, the little cigar butts from 8th Avenue, the sports writers who knocked the big fights all year but would never miss one, the novelists who seem always to be identifying with one boxer or another, the local prostitutes assisted by some talent and from Los Angeles, and also a young brunette in a wrinkled black cocktail dress who was at the bell captain's desk crying, "But I want to speak to Mr. Sinatra." "He's not here," the bell captain said. "Won't you put me through to his room?" "There are no messages going through, miss," he said. And then she turned, unsteadily, seeming close to tears, and walked through the lobby into the big, noisy casino, crowded with men interested only in money. Shortly before 7 p.m., Jack Entrater, a big gray-haired man who operates the sands, walked into the gambling room to tell some men around the blackjack table that Sinatra was getting dressed. He also said that he'd been unable to get front row seats for everybody, and so some of the men, including Leo DeRoche, who had a date, and Joey Bishop, who was accompanied by his wife, would not be able to fit in Frank Sinatra's row, but would have to take seats in the third row. When Entrater walked over to tell this to Joey Bishop, Bishop's face fell. He did not seem angry. He merely looked at Entrater with an empty silence, seeming somewhat stunned. "Joey, I'm sorry," Entrater said when the silence persisted, "but we couldn't get more than 6 together in the front row." Bishop still said nothing, but when they all appeared at the fight, Joey Bishop was in the front row, his wife in the third. The fight, called a holy war between Muslims and Christians, was preceded by the introduction of 3 balding ex-champions, Rocky Marciano, Joe Louis, Sonny Liston, and then there was the Star-Spangled Banner, sung by another man from out of the past, Eddie Fisher. It had been more than 14 years ago, but Sinatra could still remember every detail. Eddie Fisher was then the new king of the baritones, with Billy Eckstine and Guy Mitchell right with him, and Sinatra had been long counted out. One day he remembered walking into a broadcasting studio past dozens of Eddie Fisher fans waiting outside the hall, and when they saw Sinatra they began to jeer, "Frankie, Frankie, I'm swooning, I'm swooning." This was also the time when he was selling only about 30,000 records a year, when he was dreadfully miscast as a funny man on his television show, and when he recorded such disasters as "Mama Will Bark" with Dagmar. "I growled and barked on the record," Sinatra said, still horrified by the thought. "The only good it did me was with the dogs." His voice and his artistic judgment were incredibly bad in 1952, but even more responsible for his decline, say his friends, was his pursuit of Ava Gardner. She was the big movie queen then, one of the most beautiful women in the world. Sinatra's daughter Nancy recalls seeing Ava swimming one day in her father's pool, then climbing out of the water with that fabulous body, walking slowly to the fire, leaning over it for a few moments, and then it suddenly seemed that her long dark hair was all dry, miraculously and effortlessly back in place. With most women Sinatra dates, his friends say, he never knows whether they want him for what he can do for them now, or will do for them later. With Ava Gardner, it was different. He could do nothing for her later. She was on top. If Sinatra learned anything from his experience with her, he possibly learned that when a proud man is down, a woman cannot help, particularly a woman on top. Nevertheless, despite a tired voice, some deep emotion seeped into his singing during this time. One particular song that is well remembered even now is "I'm a Fool to Want You," and a friend who was in the studio when Sinatra recorded it recalled, "Frank was really worked up that night. He did the song in one take, then turned around and walked out of the studio, and that was that." Sinatra's manager at that time, a former song plugger named Hank San Nicola, said, "Ava loved Frank, but not the way he loved her. He needs a great deal of love. He wants it 24 hours a day. He must have people around. Frank is that kind of guy." Ava Gardner, San Nicola said, was very insecure. She feared she could not really hold a man. Twice he went chasing her to Africa, wasting his own career. Ava didn't want Frank's men hanging around all the time, another friend said, and this got him mad. With Nancy, he used to be able to bring the whole band home with him, and Nancy, the good Italian wife, would never complain. She'd just make everybody a plate of spaghetti. In 1953, after almost 2 years of marriage, Sinatra and Ava Gardner were divorced. Sinatra's mother reportedly arranged a reconciliation, but if Ava was willing, Frank Sinatra was not. He was seen with other women. The balance had shifted. Somewhere during this period, Sinatra seemed to change from the kid singer, the boy actor in the sailor suit, to a man. Even before he had won the Oscar in 1953 for his role in From Here to Eternity, some flashes of his old talent were coming through. In his recording of The Birth of the Blues, in his Riviera nightclub appearance that jazz critics enthusiastically praised, there was also a trend now toward LPs and away from the quick 3-minute deal, and Sinatra's concert style would have capitalized on this with or without an Oscar. In 1954, totally committed to his talent once more, Frank Sinatra was selected Metronome's Singer of the Year, and later he won the UPI disc jockey poll, unseating Eddie Fisher, who now, in Las Vegas, having sung The Star-Spangled Banner, climbed out of the ring, and the fight began. Floyd Patterson chased Clay around the ring in the first round, but was unable to reach him, and from then on, he was Clay's toy, the bout ending in a technical knockout in the 12th round. A half hour later, nearly everybody had forgotten about the fight, and was back at the gambling tables or lining up to buy tickets for the Dean Martin Sinatra Bishop nightclub routine on the stage of the Sands. This routine, which includes Sammy Davis Jr. when he is in town, consists of a few songs and much cutting up, all of it very informal, very special, and rather ethnic. Martin, a drink in hand, asking Bishop, "Did you ever see a Jiu-Jitsu?" And Bishop, playing a Jewish waiter, warning the two Italians to watch out, because I got my own group, the Mazzia. Then after the last show at the Sands, the Sinatra crowd, which now numbered about 20, and including Jilly, who had flown in from New York, Jimmy Cannon, Sinatra's favorite sports columnist, Harold Gibbons, a teamster officially expected to take over if Hoffa goes to jail, all got into a line of cars and headed for another club. It was 3 o'clock. The night was young. They stopped at the Sahara, taking a long table near the back, and listened to a bald-headed little comedian named Don Rickles, who was probably more caustic than any comic in the country. His humor is so rude and such bad taste that it offends no one. It is too offensive to be offensive. Spotting Eddie Fisher among the audience, Rickles proceeded to ridicule him as a lover, saying it was no wonder that he could not handle Elizabeth Taylor. And when two businessmen in the audience acknowledged that they were Egyptians, Rickles cut into them for their country's policy toward Israel, and he strongly suggested that the woman seated at the table with her husband was actually a hooker. When the Sinatra crowd walked in, Don Rickles could not be more delighted. Pointing to Jilly, Rickles yelled, "How's it feel to be Frank's tractor?" "Yeah, Jilly keeps walking in front of Frank, clearing the way." Then, nodding to DeRoche, Rickles said, "Stand up, Leo. Show Frank how you slide." Then he focused on Sinatra, not failing to mention Mia Farrow, nor that he was wearing a toupee, nor to say that Sinatra was washed up as a singer. And when Sinatra laughed, everybody laughed, and Rickles pointed towards Bishop. Joey Bishop keeps checking with Frank to see what's funny. Then, after Rickles told some Jewish jokes, Dean Martin stood up and yelled, "Hey, you're always talking about the Jews, never about the Italians." And Rickles cut him off with, "What do we need the Italians for? All they do is keep the flies off our fish." Sinatra laughed, they all laughed, and Rickles went on this way for nearly an hour until Sinatra, standing up, said, "All right, come on, get this thing over with, I gotta go." "Shut up and sit down," Rickles snapped. "I've had to listen to you sing." "Who do you think you're talking to?" Sinatra yelled back. "Dick Hames," Rickles replied, and Sinatra laughed again, and then Dean Martin, pouring a bottle of whiskey over his head, entirely drenching his tuxedo, pounded the table. "Who would ever believe that staggering would make a star?" Rickles said, but Martin called out, "Hey, I want to make a speech." "Shut up." "No, Don, I want to tell you," Dean Martin persisted, "that I think you're a great performer." "Well, thank you, Dean," Rickles said, seeming pleased. "But don't go by me," Martin said, plopping down in his seat. "I'm drunk." "I'll buy that," Rickles said. By 4 a.m., Frank Sinatra led the group out of the Sahara, some of them carrying their glasses of whiskey with them, sipping it along the sidewalk and in the cars. Then, returning to the Sands, they walked into the gambling casino. It was still packed with people, the roulette wheels spinning, the crap shooters screaming in the far corner. Frank Sinatra, holding a shot glass of bourbon in his left hand, walked through the crowd. He, unlike some of his friends, was perfectly pressed, his tuxedo tie precisely pointed, his shoes unsmudged. He never seems to lose his dignity, never lets his guard completely down no matter how much he has drunk, nor how long he has been up. He never sways when he walks, like Dean Martin, nor does he ever dance in the aisles or jump up on tables like Sammy Davis. A part of Sinatra, no matter where he is never there. There is always a part of him, though sometimes a small part, that remains il padrone. Even now, resting his shot glass on the blackjack table, facing the dealer, Sinatra stood a bit back from the table, not leaning against it. He reached under his tuxedo jacket, into his trouser pocket, and came up with a thick but clean wad of bills. Gently he peeled off a $100 bill and placed it on the green felt table. The dealer dealt him 2 cards. Sinatra called for a 3rd card, overbid, lost the 100. Without a change of expression, Sinatra put down a second $100 bill. He lost that. Then he put down a 3rd and lost that. Then he placed 2 $100 bills on the table and lost those. Finally, putting his 6th $100 bill on the table and losing, Sinatra moved away from the table, nodding to the man and announcing, "Good dealer." The crowd that had gathered around him now opened up to let him through, but a woman stepped in front of him, handing him a piece of paper to autograph. He signed it and then he said, "Thank you." In the rear of the Sands' large dining room was a long table reserved for Sinatra. The dining room was fairly empty at this hour, with perhaps 24 other people in the room, including a table of 4 unescorted young ladies sitting near Sinatra. On the other side of the room, at another long table, sat 7 men shoulder to shoulder against the wall, 2 of them wearing dark glasses, all of them eating quietly, speaking, hardly a word, just sitting and eating and missing nothing. The Sinatra party, after getting settled and having a few more drinks, ordered something to eat. The table was about the same size as the one reserved for Sinatra whenever he's at Jilly's in New York. And the people seated around this table in Las Vegas were many of the same people who are often seen with Sinatra at Jilly's, or at a restaurant in California, or in Italy, or in New Jersey, or wherever Sinatra happens to be. When Sinatra sits to dine, his trusted friends are close, and no matter where he is, no matter how elegant the place may be, there is something of the neighborhood showing because Sinatra, no matter how far he has come, is still something of the boy from the neighborhood, only now he can take his neighborhood with him. In some ways, this quasi-family affair at a reserved table in a public place is the closest thing Sinatra now has come to home life. Perhaps, having had a home and left it, this approximation is as close as he cares to come. Although this does not seem precisely so because he speaks with such warmth about his family, keeps in close touch with his first wife, and insists that she make no decision without first consulting him. He is always eager to place his furniture and other mementos of himself in her home or his daughter Nancy's, and he also is on amiable terms with Ava Gardner. When he was in Italy making Von Ryan's Express, they spent some time together, being pursued wherever they went by the paparazzi. It was reported then that the paparazzi had made Sinatra a collective offer of $16,000 if he would pose with Ava Gardner. Sinatra was said to have made a counteroffer of $32,000 if he could break one paparazzi arm and leg. While Sinatra is often delighted that he can be in his home completely without people, enabling him to read and think without interruption, there are occasions when he finds himself alone at night, and not by choice. He may have dialed a half-dozen women, and for one reason or another they are all unavailable, so he will call his valet, George Jacobs. "I'll be coming home for dinner tonight, George." "How many will there be?" "Just myself," Sinatra will say. "I want something light. I'm not very hungry." George Jacobs is a twice-divorced man of 36 who resembles Billy Eckstine. He has traveled all over the world with Sinatra and is devoted to him. Jacobs lives in a comfortable bachelor's apartment off Sunset Boulevard, around the corner from Whiskey A Go-Go, and he is known around town for the assortment of frisky California girls he has as friends, a few of whom, he concedes, were possibly drawn to him initially because of his closeness to Frank Sinatra. When Sinatra arrives, Jacobs will serve him dinner in the dining room. Then Sinatra will tell Jacobs that he is free to go home. If Sinatra on such evenings should ask Jacobs to stay longer or to play a few hands of poker, he would be happy to do so, but Sinatra never does. This was his second night in Las Vegas, and Frank Sinatra sat with friends in the Sands dining room until nearly 8 a.m. He slept through much of the day, then flew back to Los Angeles, and on the following morning he was driving his little golf cart through the Paramount Pictures movie lot. He was scheduled to complete 2 final scenes with a sultry blonde actress, Virna Lisi, in the film Assault on a Queen. As he maneuvered the little vehicle up the road between the big studio buildings, he spotted Steve Rossi, who, with his comedy partner Marty Allen, was making a film in an adjoining studio with Nancy Sinatra. "Hey, Dag," he yelled to Rossi. "Stop kissing Nancy." "It's part of the film, Frank," Rossi said, turning as he walked. "In the garage? It's my Dago blood, Frank." "Well, cool it," Sinatra said, winking, then cutting his golf cart around a corner and parking it outside a big drab building within which the scenes for Assault would be filmed. "Where's the fat director?" Sinatra called out, striding into the studio that was crowded with dozens of technical assistants and actors, all gathered around cameras. The director, Jack Donahue, a large man who has worked with Sinatra through 22 years on one production or another, has had headaches with this film. The script has been chopped, the actors seem restless, and Sinatra had become bored. But now there were only 2 scenes left, a short one to be filmed in the pool, and a longer and passionate one featuring Sinatra and Virna Lisi to be shot on a simulated beach. The pool scene, which dramatizes a situation where Sinatra and his hijackers fail in their attempt to sack the Queen Mary, went quickly and well. After Sinatra had been kept in the water shoulder high for a few minutes, he said, "Let's move it, fellows. It's cold in this water, and I've just gotten over one cold." So the camera crews moved in closer. Virna Lisi splashed next to Sinatra in the water, and Jack Donahue yelled to his assistants operating the fans, "Get the waves going," and another man gave the command, "Agitate," and Sinatra broke out in song, "Agitate in rhythm," then quieted down just before the camera started to roll. Frank Sinatra was on the beach in the next situation, supposedly gazing up at the stars, and Virna Lisi was to approach him, toss one of her shoes near him to announce her presence, then sit near him and prepare for a passionate session. Just before beginning, Miss Lisi made a practice toss of her shoe toward the prone figure of Sinatra sprawled on the beach, and she tossed her shoe. Sinatra called out, "Hit me in my bird and I'm going home." Virna Lisi, who understands little English and certainly none of Sinatra's special vocabulary, looked confused, but everybody behind the camera laughed. She threw the shoe toward him. It twirled in the air, landed on his stomach. "Well, that's about 3 inches too high," he announced. She again was puzzled by the laughter behind the camera. Then Jack Donahue had them rehearse their lines, and Sinatra, still very charged from the Las Vegas trip and anxious to get the cameras rolling, said, "Let's try one." Donahue, not certain that Sinatra and Lisi knew their lines well enough, nevertheless said okay, and an assistant with a clapboard called, "419, take one," and Virna Lisi approached with the shoe, tossed it at Frank lying on the beach. It fell short of his thigh, and Sinatra's right eye raised almost imperceptibly, but the crew got the message, smiled. "What do the stars tell you tonight?" Miss Lisi said, delivering her first line, and sitting next to Sinatra on the beach. "The stars tell me tonight I'm an idiot," Sinatra said, "a gold-plated idiot to get mixed up in this thing." "Cut," Donahue said. There were some microphone shadows on the sand, and Virna Lisi was not sitting in the proper place near Sinatra. 419, take two, the clapboard man called. Miss Lisi again approached, threw the shoe at him, this time falling short, Sinatra exhaling only slightly, and she said, "What do the stars tell you tonight?" "The stars tell me I'm an idiot, a gold-plated idiot to get mixed up in this thing." Then, according to the script, Sinatra was to continue, "Do you know what we're getting into? The minute we step on the deck of the Queen Mary, we've just tattooed ourselves." But Sinatra, who often improvises on lines, recited them. "Do you know what we're getting into? The minute we step on the deck of that mother's-ass ship—" "No, no," Donahue interrupted, shaking his head. "I don't think that's right." The cameras stopped. Some people laughed, and Sinatra looked up from his position in the sand as if he had been unfairly interrupted. "I don't see why that can't work," he began, but Richard Conti, standing behind the camera, yelled, "It won't play in London." Donahue pushed his hand through his thinning gray hair and said, but not really in anger, "You know, that scene was pretty good until somebody blew the line." "Yeah," agreed the cameraman, Billy Daniels, his head popping out from around the camera. "It was a pretty good piece." "Watch your language," Sinatra cut in. Then Sinatra, who has a genius for figuring out ways of not reshooting scenes, suggested a way in which the film could be used and the mother line could be re-recorded later. This met with approval. Then the cameras were rolling again. Virna Lisi was leaning towards Sinatra in the sand, and then he pulled her down close to him. The camera now moved in for a close-up of their faces, ticking away for a few long seconds, but Sinatra and Lisi did not stop kissing. They just lay together in the sand, wrapped in one another's arms. And then Virna Lisi's left leg just slightly began to rise a bit, and everybody in the studio now watched in silence, not saying anything until Donahue finally called out, "If you ever get through, let me know. I'm running out of film." Then Miss Lisi got up, straightened out her white dress, brushed back her blonde hair, and touched her lipstick, which was smeared. Sinatra got up, a little smile on his lips, and headed for his dressing room. Passing an older man who stood near a camera, Sinatra asked, "How's your Bell and Howell?" The older man smiled. "It's fine, Frank." "Good." In his dressing room, Sinatra was met by an automobile designer who had the plans for Sinatra's new custom-built model to replace the $25,000 Gia he has been driving for the last few years. He also was awaited by his secretary, Tom Conroy, who had a bag full of fan mail, including a letter from New York's Mayor John Lindsay and by Bill Miller, Sinatra's pianist, who would rehearse some of the songs that would be recorded later in the evening for Sinatra's newest album, Moonlight Sinatra. While Sinatra does not mind hamming it up a bit on a movie set, he is extremely serious about his recording sessions, as he explained to a British writer, Robin Douglas Home. "Once you're on that record singing, it's you and you alone. If it's bad and gets you criticized, it's you who's to blame, no one else. If it's good, it's also you. With a film, it's never like that. There are producers and scriptwriters, and hundreds of men in offices, and the thing is taken right out of your hands. With a record, you're it. But now the days are short. I'm in the autumn of the year, and now I think of my life, as vintage wine from fine old kegs. It no longer matters what song he is singing, or who wrote the words. They are all his words, his sentiments. They are all chapters from the lyrical novel of his life. Life is a beautiful thing, as long as I hold the string." When Sinatra drives to the studio, he seems to dance out of the car across the sidewalk into the front door. Then, snapping his fingers, he is standing in front of the orchestra in an intimate, airtight room, and soon he is dominating every man, every instrument, every sound wave. Some of the musicians have accompanied him for 25 years, have gotten old hearing him sing, "You make me feel so young." When his voice is on, as it was tonight, Sinatra is in ecstasy. The room becomes electric. There is an excitement that spreads through the orchestra and is felt in the control booth where a dozen men, Sinatra's friends, wave at him from behind the glass. One of the men is the Dodgers pitcher, Don Drysdale. "Hey, Big D," Sinatra calls out. "Hey, baby." Another is the professional golfer, Bo Winninger. There are also numbers of pretty women standing in the booth behind the engineers, women who smile at Sinatra and softly move their bodies to the mellow mood of his music. Will this be moon love? Nothing but moon love. Will you be gone when the dawn comes stealing through? After he is finished, the record is played back on tape, and Nancy Sinatra, who has just walked in, joins her father near the front of the orchestra to hear the playback. They listen silently, all eyes on them, the king, the princess. When the music ends, there is applause from the control booth. Nancy smiles, and her father snaps his fingers and says, kicking a foot, "Ooba deeba booba doo." Then Sinatra calls to one of his men, "Hey, Sarge, think I can have a half a cup of coffee?" Sarge Weiss, who had been listening to the music, slowly gets up. "Didn't mean to wake you, Sarge," Sinatra says, smiling. Then Weiss brings the coffee, and Sinatra looks at it, smells it, then announces, "I thought he'd be nice to me, but it's really coffee." There are more smiles, and then the orchestra prepares for the next number, and 1 hour later, it is over. The musicians put their instruments into their cases, grab their coats, and begin to file out, saying goodnight to Sinatra. He knows them all by name, knows much about them personally, from their bachelor days, through their divorces, through their ups and downs, as they know him. When a French horn player, a short Italian named Vincent de Rosa, who has played with Sinatra since the Lucky Strike hit parade days on radio, strolled by, Sinatra reached out to hold him for a second. "Vincenzo," Sinatra said, "how's your little girl?" "She's fine, Frank." "Oh, she's not a little girl anymore," Sinatra corrected himself. "She's a big girl now." "Yes, she goes to college now, USC. "That's great. She's also got a little talent, I think, Frank, as a singer." Sinatra was silent for a moment, then said, "Yes, but it's very good for her to get her education first, Vincenzo." Vincent de Rosa nodded. "Yes, Frank," he said, and then he said, "Well, good night, Frank. Good night, Vincenzo." After the musicians had all gone, Sinatra left the recording room and joined his friends in the corridor. He was going to go out and do some drinking with Drysdale, Winninger, and a few other friends, but he first walked to the other end of the corridor to say goodnight to Nancy, who was getting her coat and was planning to drive home in her own car. After Sinatra had kissed her on the cheek, he hurried to join his friends at the door. But before Nancy could leave the studio, one of Sinatra's men, Al Silvani, a former prize fight manager, joined her. "Are you ready to leave yet, Nancy?" "Oh, thanks, Al," she said, "but I'll be all right." "Pope's orders," Silvani said, holding his hands up, palms out. Only after Nancy had pointed to two of her friends who could escort her home, and only after Silvani recognized them as friends, would he leave. The rest of the month was bright and balmy. The record session had gone magnificently, the film was finished, the television shows were out of the way, and now Sinatra was in his Gia, driving out to his office to begin coordinating his latest projects. He had an engagement at the Sands, a new spy film called The Naked Runner to be shot in England, and a couple more albums to do in the immediate months ahead. Within a week, he would be 50 years old. Life is a beautiful thing, as long as I hold the string. I'd be a silly so-and-so if I should ever let go. Frank Sinatra stopped his car. The light was red. Pedestrians passed quickly across his windshield, but, as usual, one did not. It was a girl in her 20s. She remained at the curb staring at him. Through the corner of his left eye, he could see her, and he knew, because it happens almost every day, that she was thinking, "It looks like him, but is it?" Just before the light turned green, Sinatra turned toward her, looked directly into her eyes, waiting for the reaction he knew would come. It came and he smiled. She smiled, and he was gone.